This hearing of the Government Oversight Reform Committee will come to order. The Oversight Committee exists to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have a right to know that the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers, because taxpayers have a right to know what they get from their government. We will work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people and bring genuine reform to the Federal bureaucracy. This is the mission of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. In 2012 State of the Union, President Obama declared, "This country needs an all-out, all-of-the-above strategy that develops every available source of American energy." Unfortunately, the actions of the Obama administration reflects a much narrower approach. The reality is the Obama administration has taken several actions that would limit the production and use of oil, natural gas, and coal energy sources. I might add, they have also shut down Yucca, effectively dooming nuclear. These actions are justified by the advancement of rhetoric and reliant on distortion of the actual facts. For example, the President frequently states that the U.S. only has 2% of the world's oil reserves. Nothing could be further from the truth. The statement of proven reserves has been disproven for my entire life. The fact is that America ignores a potential multi-trillion-dollar barrels of oil that we know exist that have not yet been proven. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, talks of proven reserves counting virtually every drop of oil, while America talks only about an amount roughly equal to the amount that we said we had in the 50s when I was born. According to the Institute of Energy Research, the U.S. has 1.4 trillion barrels of technically recoverable oil, enough to meet the demand for at least the next 200 years. The President likes to take credit for increased oil production, but in reality, the dramatic increase in production that has happened on private lands in spite of the administration's policy of obstructing all use of Federal lands. Today, we enjoy a 36% reduction in new drilling on Federal lands as a result of these policies. The Congressional Research Service reports that 96% of U.S. oil production increases in 2007 have occurred on non-Federal lands. This is the Obama administration has closed off public lands to exploration and drilling that would have been available just a few years ago. Well, many Americans believe that construction of the Keystone Pipeline is key to relieving escalating gas prices. The President has stood in the way and even had the audacity to claim that an executive order that specifically does nothing new, advances nothing new, expedites nothing new, and only fails to stop that which would occur without any effort at the same timeline, in fact, was his initiative. It is ironic that the President stood in front of empty green oil pipeline for his Photoshop, because the empty green promise of this administration should be, in fact, the key to understanding Obama's all-of-the-above strategy. Any energy made above ground counts. Any energy found below ground is off limits. We should hearken back to the period of time in which the Democrats controlled the House, the Senate, and the White House. During that period of time, on the President's insistence, cap-and-trade was passed out of the House, which would have curtailed virtually all coal production in this country and severely limited other sources. It failed in the Senate, but not for a lack of leadership from the President. Today, by regulatory fiat, the President is effectively shutting down 26 gigawatts of electric power produced from coal as we speak. The bottom line is virtually all of the success and security of our nation to develop avenues of oil and natural gas have either come from the previous administration and simply are a legacy that continues in spite of this one, or in fact have occurred on private lands in spite of the best efforts by the Federal Government to stop it. We cannot exist in a modern-day superpower unless we have means to fuel a 21st century economy. President Obama has to make a choice. He can either be part of the problem or he can be part of the solution. All of the above is only half of the solution. We have to have an all of the above and all of the below mentality if we are, in fact, to deliver affordable energy for the American people. It is often said, but needs to be said as often as possible. The Stone Age did not end because we ran out of stones. It ended because we harnessed energy. And with that, I recognize the distinguished ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank you for calling today's hearing. The title of today's hearing poses the following question. Does President Obama really support an all of the above energy strategy? In my opinion, the answer is clearly yes, resounding and obvious. Under President Obama, total domestic oil production in the United States has increased by 14% since the final year of the Bush administration. Every year since Mr. Obama became president, total U.S. crude oil production has increased. In 2011, over 2 billion barrels of oil were produced in the United States. This is the highest rate of domestic oil production since 2003. In 2011, onshore oil production on federal lands was the most productive since 2003, with 112 million barrels produced. Offshore oil production had its most productive year in 2010, with 618 million barrels produced. As part of this all-of-the-above strategy, natural gas production is also now at record levels. In fact, it is at its highest level in 30 years, with more than 28 trillion cubic feet produced in 2011. The administration has also pursued nuclear power. It approved an $8.3 billion conditional loan guarantee for nuclear reactors in Burke County, Georgia, which is the first nuclear plant to receive a construction license in more than 3 decades. After touring the facility, Energy Secretary Stephen Chu stated, and I quote, "Nuclear energy is a critical part of the President's all-of-the-above energy strategy." End of quote. The President has also requested an additional $770 million for nuclear programs in his budget for 2013. In a stark difference from the previous administration, the Obama administration has also invested significantly in clean energy technologies of the future that promote our global competitiveness and enhance our energy independence. Because of investments in solar, biofuel, wind, geothermal, and electric vehicle technologies that were included in the Recovery Act, the United States is now home to the world's largest photovoltaic generation facility, one of the world's largest wind farms, and the world's largest concentrated solar power plant. In addition to taking these steps, the administration's new fuel economy standards will reduce oil consumption by 2.2 million barrels a day, saving American families an average of $8,000 at the pump. I understand that many of the witnesses invited by the Chairman today will express their desire to drill for even more oil and to remove existing health and safety protections to allow them to do so. They will also argue that the administration is somehow blocking their efforts. To the contrary, arguments that the administration has been refusing to approve drilling permits in the Gulf are a complete myth. Following the monumental BP disaster, the administration worked quickly with industry to develop and implement new offshore drilling rules to reduce the chances that such a catastrophe would ever happen again. Since enacting these rules, the administration has issued more than 400 deep water drilling permits, and Gulf operations have resumed more safely as a result. In addition, in 2011, the administration offered 21 million acres for new offshore oil and gas development. And next month, an additional 38 million acres will be offered as part of a lease sale in the Gulf of Mexico, an area estimated to hold close to 31 billion barrels of oil and 134 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. The record is abundantly clear. President Obama has pursued an aggressive strategy to significantly boost domestic energy production from all sources: oil, natural gas, nuclear, clean energy, and he deserves an enormous amount of credit for his accomplishment. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. All members will have 7 days to submit opening statements for the record. We now recognize our opening panel. Yes, I'll get it. Thank you. There we go. Mr. Michael Granser is the Secretary of Pennsylvania's Department of Environmental Protection. Ms. Catherine Skama, no middle, okay, I'll get it right before it's over, I promise, is the Vice President of Government and Public Affairs at the Western Energy Alliance. Welcome. Mr. Mark Perry is a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research. Mr. Daniel J. Weiss is Senior Fellow and Director of Climate Strategy at the Center for American Progress Action Fund. And Mr. Charles T. Drevna is President of the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers. And lastly, Mr. Peter Glazer is a partner at Troutman and Sanders, LLP. Pursuant to our committee rules, just like on television, would you please rise to take the oath? And raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record indicate that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. Please be seated. This is a large panel today, and each of your full opening statements will be placed in the record. So I would ask you to please observe the timer light in front of you. Try to stay as close to your 5 minutes or under as you can so that we can get to a sufficient amount of questions. Contrary to opening statements, we do not know whether what you're going to say today is accurate or inaccurate, regardless of presumption. So we would like to have a healthy dialogue so that we can get to the full and hopefully bipartisan understanding. Mr. Granser.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. I am from Pennsylvania. We are in the middle, as you all know, of a natural gas exploration and extraction revolution in Pennsylvania. And I want to just mention, react to Representative Cummings' statement. Nobody on this panel, certainly me, above all, DEP Secretary of Pennsylvania, has any desire to remove any health and safety protections. As a matter of fact, that's one of the points that we're here today on, and that is the states are already doing a very fine job regulating, for example, natural gas extraction. It's being done in Pennsylvania. And I'd also say that the point that natural gas production has increased, that is true, but it's true in spite of the Federal Government. It's true in Pennsylvania. Our production has quadrupled since 2009, and it's because the Federal Government is not intervening and interposing. It's because Pennsylvania is getting it right. What I see in Pennsylvania as DEP Secretary is, of course, we have a coal state, and we're not totally a coal state. We're very diverse. We have nuclear. We have a very healthy nuclear industry. We have coal, we have natural gas. We have oil. We have wind and solar. But what I see is a Federal Government that seems to be picking winners and losers, attempting to be picking winners and losers, and promulgating a regulatory agenda that does not have a all-of-the-above flavor to it. It picks winners and losers. And I'll just use a couple of examples. In my own state, with respect to the hydraulic fracturing, I think the Federal Government has created somewhat of a hostility. There's a hostile attitude towards the science of hydraulic fracturing, which has been ongoing in this country for many, many years, 60 years probably, and the Federal Government has never, until now, expressed any interest whatsoever to be involved in it, and I cover that in my testimony. And there seems to be some fear churning going on as well. One of the matters in my state was in Dimock, Pennsylvania, where after the state had taken control, had control of the matter, Federal government came in and started doing water testing this year. After 4 rounds of water testing, there is no problems indicated. And now I think the Federal government is looking for an exit strategy from Dimock, and I'm not sure how they're going to do that or if they're going to do that before the election. In terms of air regulations, what I see is a severe hostility towards coal. Absolutely. The air regulations are hostile to coal. I'm talking about Utility Act. I'm talking about the transport rule. And I'm talking about an incredible overactivity with respect to the NAAQS, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. This administration in 3.5 years has done more with respect to NAAQS that has been done in history. Under Clinton, under Bush, more. They've already announced 4 of the 6 that they're going to change, and for some very shaky technical reasons. And I'll tell you, with respect to my state on the air regulations, EPA has refused to consider that those air regulations are going to kill waste coal burning plants in my state, which provide an important environmental benefit. Another matter is the coal ash residuals regulation. Here's the EPA headed towards, with the help of a friendly piece of litigation now, regulating coal ash residuals as hazardous waste. That would be devastating in my state and other states too, and I've written to Congress on that on several occasions. There's no scientific justification for it. There's no legal justification for it. It would cost the loss of between 180,000 jobs and 316,000 jobs, and cost between $78 billion and $110 billion over 20 years. Another area where my state has seen this is in the coal mining permits, the water aspects of coal mining permits. EPA has interposed more than they ever have in history, and we think for a technically very questionable basis. I think the Chairman hit the nail on the head with respect to nuclear. We see the Federal government not stepping to the plate to fulfill its promise to deal with the nuclear waste disposal issue, and in fact reneged on its promise. And that's costing billions of dollars, or will cost billions of dollars. And really the Federal government needs to deal with that. I did hear a quip the other day, and it follows on the Chairman's comment, that the all of the above moniker, if you will, really means only the above, meaning only wind, only solar, only those things. We have assets here in our country under the ground in my state and in other states that can be safely and environmentally extracted in an environmentally sensitive manner, and all economies need available, abundant domestic energy. And our potential in that regard, my state and in our nation, is off the charts. With that, I'll leave it to the next testifier and look forward to the questions.
Thank you. I will note that as someone born and raised in Ohio, you were as close as I could get to somebody from our region with the same abundance.
Well, I got good news for you. I was born in Cleveland.
East or west side?
Shaker Heights, not Shaker Heights, is that
yeah.
right? Shaker Heights.
Okay.
That was a long time ago, and I don't remember very much, but I was born there, so I'm told.
You should come back. My family's in Cleveland, and Cleveland Heights and Shaker Heights.
I will do that.
I'll give you that time back later from that round of questioning. Ms. Gamma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee. Western Energy Alliance represents about 400 companies engaged in all aspects of environmentally responsible oil and natural gas development in the West. Our members are proud to produce 27% of the nation's natural gas and 14% of oil production, while disturbing 0.07% of public lands. It seems that my industry has figured into the administration's strategy as an annoyance to be avoided in favor of its preferred energy sources. The attitude has translated into budgets intended to reduce so-called overproduction of oil and natural gas through increased taxes. One thing that particularly rings hollow with Western producers is the administration taking credit for increased oil and natural gas production. Despite all the obstacles put in place by this administration, oil and gas companies responding to market forces have dramatically increased productions on private lands and reduced foreign imports. But it's not just a matter of who should take credit for increased U.S. production. It's important that we recognize the role of policies and regulations that stifle economic growth. Where the administration has the most controls, the Interior Department has put in place more obstacles to producers. On onshore public lands, Oil production has declined by nearly 15%, and natural gas increased by a scant 0.5% from 2010 to 2011. However, natural gas production on all Federal lands declined by 27% from 2009 levels, while natural gas production on State and private lands increased 28%. To deflect criticism, we continue to hear accusations and misleading statistics that industry is letting millions of acres sit idle. Yet this tired rhetoric fails to take into account the fact that not every lease has recoverable oil and gas, and the huge obstacles the Federal Government places in the way of producers. Western Energy Alliance recently released a study of the enormous economic potential of just 20 projects on public lands. These 20 projects of about 3,100 wells per year would generate nearly 121,000 sustained jobs, $8 billion in wages, and $27.5 billion in annual economic impact, all from just about 3,100 wells. However, once a project is proposed by a company, the Interior Department's Bureau of Land Management must complete environmental analysis under the National Environmental Policy Act. We're seeing even small 9-well projects take over 4 years, and large projects take over 7 years. In fact, if we look at projects waiting over 3 years, we see that government delays are preventing the creation of nearly 65,000 jobs and $15 billion in economic activity annually. These NEPA delays are the direct result of government inaction that prevents companies from operating on their leases. Other obstacles abound. Interior Secretary Salazar started his tenure by canceling leases in Utah. He followed that up with policies that added 3 new layers of analysis to the leasing process, which has resulted in an 80% decline in leases offered in the Rocky Mountain states. If there was any doubt about his intention to slow oil and gas production, Secretary Salazar allayed those doubts when he introduced new policies by saying his agency would no longer be a candy store for the petroleum industry. The attitude that there was a new sheriff in town who needed to stop unfettered development, as if a responsible industry providing over a quarter of our nation's natural gas production while disturbing less than 0.1% of acreage was an industry gone wild. Secretary Salazar recently admitted that it takes the government 298 days on average to process drilling permits and promised to reduce the time to 60 days. Since every proposed budget for the last 4 years has attempted to zero out funding for improving permit processing, again, the rhetoric doesn't match the reality. Interior has also decided to regulate hydraulic fracturing, despite the lack of a single incident on Federal lands and successful State regulation. We estimate that will add another 100 days onto permitting times. For the last 3 years, we have been part of an anything but oil and gas energy strategy. We're heartened that the administration has changed the rhetoric. Now we're just waiting for reality to catch up. While I've only had time for a few instances of policies that are preventing development, I look forward to some more examples as questions come up.
Thank you. Mr. Perry.
Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, and other members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear today. In my written testimony, I've provided 10 pages of analysis on the topic you're considering, and here is an oral summary of that testimony. My main point today, I think, is that, as the Chairman has indicated, it would be more accurate to describe President Obama's energy strategy as some of the above rather than all of the above for the following reasons. President Obama has shown certain favoritism towards alternative energies, which he has described publicly as energy sources of the future, while he has publicly dismissed oil as an energy of the past. That some of the above favoritism has been demonstrated in several ways. Domestic production of fossil fuels on Federal lands fell to a 9-year low in fiscal year 2011, as crude oil production fell by 14%, the largest annual decrease in at least a decade, and natural gas production fell by more than 9%. The Administration's fiscal year 2013 budget targets oil and natural gas companies with 8 proposals for higher taxes, which it's estimated would burden the oil and gas industry with almost $86 billion in higher taxes over the next 10 years. There are drilling restrictions or limited permitting for oil and natural gas that continue off the Mid-Atlantic coast and much of the Gulf of Mexico, in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, on Federal lands in the Rockies, where leases are down 70% since 2009. Other actions taken by the Administration, including rejecting the Keystone XL pipeline, canceling millions of acres in offshore lease sales and closing the majority of the outer continental shelf to new energy production for the next 5 years demonstrate an administration that does not support an all-of-the-above energy strategy that includes increasing domestic production of fossil fuels that will remain critical to America's energy and economic future for many decades. In contrast, the President's proposed budget for fiscal year 2013 includes preferences for the politically favored green energy sector in the form of numerous tax subsidies, tax credits, public expenditures, procurement preferences, and grants for alternative energy. In my written testimony, I have identified 9 specific budget provisions that favor alternative energy. Based on the Obama administration's demonstrated preference for alternative energies that are supposed to be the energy sources of a future that is no longer dependent on traditional hydrocarbon energies of the past, a misleading message is being conveyed to the American people that our country's need for substantial levels of oil, natural gas, and coal will soon be a distant memory. The reality, however, is much different. In its most recent forecast in January of 2012, the U.S. Department of Energy estimated that the importance of fossil fuels for meeting the energy demands of the U.S. economy will decline only modestly over the next several decades from 83% of total U.S. energy consumption in 2010 to 77% in 2035. In contrast, despite all of the attention, preferences from the Obama administration, loan guarantees, and taxpayer subsidies for renewable energy, their contribution to U.S. energy consumption of 7.3% in 2012 was barely higher than the 7.1% share back in 1997. Current estimates from the Department of Energy predict that even by the year 2035, the renewable energy share of U.S. energy consumption will be less than 11%. Even the government's own forecasts predict that renewable energy will continue to play a relatively minor role as an energy source over the next several decades out to the year 2035. And traditional energy sources like oil, gas, and coal will continue to provide the overwhelming share, more than 3/4 of the fuel required to meet U.S. energy demand for the next 3 decades at least. By favoring new, costly, subsidy-dependent alternative energy sources over traditional sources, and by not fully supporting the proven job-creating, low-cost fossil fuels, it would be more accurate to describe President Obama's costly energy strategy as some of the most costly above instead of all of the above. What we really want is an energy policy that is not based on all of the above or some of the above, regardless of cost, reliability, and economic and scientific merits, but rather an energy policy is grounded in the logic of all of the energy sources that are actually cost competitive. President Obama might wish for an energy future of alternative energy, but the scientific and economic realities suggest that the fuels of the future will mostly be the same as the fuels of the past: dependable, reliable, low-cost oil, natural gas, coal, and nuclear. Thank you.
Mr. Weiss.
Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund, a tax-exempt organization dedicated to progressive values and ideas. First, I'd like to address the assumption that producing more oil will lower gasoline prices. In fact, the Associated Press examined 30 years of monthly production and gasoline price data and found, and I quote, "No statistical correlation between how much oil comes out of U.S. wells and the price at the pump," unquote. In other words, the idea that we can drill our way to lower oil prices is rhetoric and not a record. If so, then Canada would have had very low gasoline prices this year because they produce nearly all their own oil. And in fact, Canada also had high gasoline prices this year, according to the Wall Street Journal. Now let's address the question posed for this hearing. Does President Obama really support an all-of-the-above energy strategy? What is an all-of-the-above energy strategy? To most Americans, it means we must do 3 things. First, develop the energy resources of today while using them more efficiently. Second, invest in the new, cleaner technologies of tomorrow. Third, reduce public health threats from pollution generated by producing and burning coal, oil, and other fossil fuels. We've just heard all the rhetoric. Now let's review the Obama record on the all-of-the-above energy strategy checklist. First, develop energy resources. U.S. oil production is at its highest since 1998. The Energy Information Administration just demonstrated that annual oil production from Federal lands and waters was higher under the first 3 years of President Obama than under the last 3 years of his predecessor. In all, this was 646 million barrels, 12% higher than 2008. Let's look at oil imports and are we using oil efficiently? In 2011, the United States imported only 45% of its oil, the lowest since 1997. When the modernization of fuel economy standards is complete in 2025, we will use 2 million fewer barrels of oil per day, and drivers will save $8,000 per car in lower gasoline purchases. And I say this as the son-in-law and brother-in-law of car dealers. Nuclear power. The first 2 nuclear reactors in a generation were just approved in February for a plant in Waynesboro, Georgia. Coal employment. The U.S. Mine Safety and Health Administration reports that there were more coal miners employed in the United States in 2011 than in any year since 1997. So it looks like we're producing more of the resources we have and using them wisely. Are we investing in clean energy and jobs? In 2011, U.S. clean energy investments moved ahead of China for the first time in 2008, according to Bloomberg. The non-hydro renewable electricity generation will nearly double between 2008 to 2012, according to the Energy Information Administration. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics recently reported that, quote, in 2010, 3.1 million jobs in the United States were associated with the production of green goods and services. Last question, are we protecting public health from pollution? The cross-state air pollution rule and mercury air toxic standards will reduce smog, acid rain, mercury, and cancer-causing pollution from power plants. These rules will protect children, seniors, and the infirm from air pollution and will save up to 45,000 lives annually. The record demonstrates that President Obama passes the all-of-the-above test. What about the House of Representatives? We know that it supports expanded oil and gas production. What about the other essential elements of all of the above? Is the House of Representatives supporting clean energy investments and jobs? Well, the House passed FY 2013 budget, which slashed these investments, according to the Office of Management and Budget. And I quote, clean energy programs would be cut by 19%. Instead, the House budget would retain $40 billion in tax breaks for big oil, even though the 5 largest companies earned $137 billion in profits in 2011. And the House has not extended the production tax credit for wind and other renewable energy sources, even though it expires at the end of this year. There's a bipartisan extension bill that's languished since last November. Would the House protect public health from pollution? Last year, the House held 209 votes to weaken public health safeguards or environmental protection, including blocking protections from mercury. What about so President Obama has successfully pursued an all-the-above energy strategy by increasing oil production, reducing imports, and using our oil more efficiently, and protecting public health from pollution. The House of Representatives has ignored oil use reductions, slashed investments for new clean energy technologies, and would eviscerate public health protection from hazardous pollutants. This is an oil-above-all strategy that would benefit big oil companies at the expense of everyone else. Hopefully, the House of Representatives will join President Obama in supporting his and all-of-the-above energy strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And before I go to the next witness, just so you're prepared when we go to questioning, I heard the ranking member use the exact same term you used, the $8,000 per family. So your source is probably the same. If I do my calculation on gasoline correctly, at $4 a gallon, $8,000 is 2,000 gallons. 2,000 gallons at 20 miles per gallon would take a family for free 40,000 miles a year. Be prepared to answer how you're going to get that much savings and have your sources ready. Mr. Drevna, no, I just want to make sure you were fully informed because both of you used a term that we've never seen on this side of the dais before. Mr. Drevna.
Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee, thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify today. I'm Charlie Drevna. I'm President of AFPM, the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers. We are a trade association that was formerly known as the National Petrochemical and Refiners Association until earlier this year. We represent high-tech American manufacturers who use oil and gas to make almost all the fuels, heating oil, and petrochemicals used in our nation. Let me first echo the statements of Secretary Krancer, but we are not here, sir, to dismantle health and safety provisions, and any suggestion that to the contrary is totally inaccurate. And quite honestly, I think that's part of the problem, that we see as we've categorized the war on fossil fuels. And in response on the global markets and increasing domestic supply, and it will not lower prices, well, I only have to reference to President Obama when he suggested that we can release oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to lower prices. I can also look to President Obama when he went to Brazil and to Saudi and asked the Saudis to increase production so we can lower prices. Markets react to a stimulus, and if the United States can send that stimulus, that message to the world markets that we are dead serious about our energy and national security, it could go a long way to moderating prices throughout the globe. And the entire oil and natural gas sector supports more than 9 million American jobs, making it, and pays more than $31 billion in taxes to the government, making it the largest taxpayer to the Federal Government, plus additional funds to State and local governments. And the tax provisions that American oil, natural gas, and refiners get are the same provisions that every manufacturer gets. They're not subsidies. They're not anything special that anyone else gets. And even though these companies make big profits, it's better than losing money and going bankrupt like other companies that the Federal Government has tried to prop up. And contrary to popular opinion about an energy crisis and our long-term dependence on foreign oil, the fact is the United States is an energy giant, and we can meet all our needs domestically by 2025 without the need for taxpayer money. The shale gas revolution currently underway in states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Oklahoma, the Dakotas, Colorado, underscores the vast potential of U.S. resources. Just 4 years ago, proved reserves of natural gas were estimated to be 10 to 15 years. Today, those estimates are 40 to 100 years, a staggering change in a very small time frame. These vast new resources have driven down natural gas prices and have led to a manufacturing renaissance in industries that use natural gas as electricity or as a feedstock, such as the petrochemical manufacturing, which is actually building new plants and infrastructure in Pennsylvania, Oklahoma, Texas, and Louisiana. And ladies and gentlemen, that is just the beginning. This renaissance happened because of continuous innovation and ingenuity of the industry. There were no government plans or policies or blue ribbon panels involved. There were no subsidies and no government-favored winners or losers. Rather, the drastic turnaround came about through free market incentives to find and produce more supply. The same can be said for crude oil. However, government actions are threatening the future of this renaissance. In debating energy policy, it is important that we do not lose sight of the regulatory environment the fuel and petrochemical manufacturers face currently. The recent resignation of EPA Region 6 Administrator, Mr. Armendariz, shined a bright public light on an issue we already knew and confront daily. The EPA and this administration are hostile to fossil fuels. Fuel manufacturers are being hit with costly and, in many cases, conflicting regulations that threaten refinery operations in our nation. These include Tier 3 regulations to reduce sulfur in gasoline, greenhouse gas regulations, lengthy permitting delays. And we have to really think about how a permitting delay impacts investment, impacts future operations, and therefore jobs in this country. And finally, can't go without mentioning the unachievable requirements under the Renewable Fuels Act standard involving biofuels. Our recommendations are simple. The administration should allow the oil and gas industry to fully develop domestic resources and immediately approve the Keystone XL pipeline. They should consider the cumulative impact of new regulations prior to imposing them and eliminate costly, contradictory, or ineffective regulations. Last week, the Wall Street Journal ran an excerpt from a November 16, 1980 memo to President-elect Ronald Reagan from his coordinating committee entitled Economic Strategy for the Reagan Administration. One quote is particularly beneficial. I quote, "The battle between government regulation and the private market is nowhere more apparent than in energy, where the market has a decisive comparative advantage. Government intrusion into energy production and use provides a glaring example of how regulation costs us all dearly." Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Glazer.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cummings, members of the committee, my name is Peter Glazer. I am a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of the law firm of Troutman Sanders. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to give this testimony today concerning the effect of the administration's policies on coal. Let me say at the outset that although I represent clients in the coal industry, my testimony today is my own and does not necessarily represent the views of any of my clients, and neither I nor my firm is being compensated by any client for this testimony. Based on a review of this administration's policies towards coal, it can only be concluded that coal does not represent a portion of the administration's all-of-the-above energy policy. This conclusion is plain from a review of the policies the Environmental Protection Agency is implementing that affect the use of coal in new and existing coal-fueled electric generating stations and in industrial boilers, and it is also clear from the policies of EPA and the Office of Surface Mining for the permitting of coal mines. EPA's policies are having their intended effect. The agency now has one rule, the so-called MATS rule or UMACT rule, that effectively prohibits the construction of new coal-fueled electric generation, and it has another proposed rule, the Greenhouse Gas New Source Performance Standards rule, that will accomplish the same result. It is also in the process of implementing a suite of power sector regulations that is leading to a large number of retirements of existing coal-fueled electric generation. And it is making it extremely difficult to permit coal mines in Appalachia and other places, threatening the ability to continue mining in those regions and creating the possibility of the loss of hundreds of thousands of mining and related jobs. EPA's anti-coal policies are motivated by what appears to be the misplaced conclusion that such policies are needed to protect the public health and welfare, but EPA's own statistics show that over the last several decades, even as the use of coal increased, emissions of traditional pollutants from coal-fueled electric generation has steadily declined. Coal and environmental protection are compatible. Moreover, EPA has far overstated the health and welfare benefits its rules will supposedly create for reasons that I go to in my written testimony. Indeed, EPA's anti-coal regulations will actually harm public health and welfare. Studies show that the rules will cause very large increases in cost to electric ratepayers, will eliminate jobs, even net of so-called green jobs created, and will harm the economy. These costs will fall on those least able to afford them, disproportionately fall on those least able to afford them, and it is a truism that wealth equals health. And the corollary is that reducing disposable income through increased energy costs will create negative health outcomes as people are forced to cut off their air conditioning in the summer, reduce expenditures for health services, or lose their health insurance because of lost jobs. EPA's policies are also impairing the reliability of the electric grid, threatening blackouts, which tend to occur when the weather is the hottest and air conditioning is needed the most. EPA's estimates of the number of retirements, electric generation retirements its rules will cause are dramatically understated, far below even the number of retirements that have already been announced as a result of EPA's regulations. Yet EPA has never produced a valid study of how its regulations will affect the reliability of the grid, and indeed it has disregarded recommendations from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that it cumulatively assess the effect of all of its regulations on grid reliability. Indeed, the business community has been asking EPA from the beginning of this administration to cumulatively assess how all of its regulations together will affect the electric, mining, and other sectors. Yet despite the fact that executive orders of Presidents Obama and Clinton require cumulative analysis, EPA has refused to produce such a study. In the end, EPA appears to fail to grasp that coal is good for the economy and good for Americans. As global economic conditions become increasingly competitive, America must look to where it has competitive advantage as compared with other countries. Coal is one of our competitive strengths. There is more heating value in coal in America than there is in Saudi oil reserves. Coal is comparatively low cost to produce and transport. Its price has been low and stable over time. It is easy to stockpile, and it has been the bedrock of the American electric system for a very long time. It would be a serious mistake to think that America can be competitive without coal. Certainly some of our main international competitors, such as India and China, are increasing their use of coal. In sum, this administration, and particularly EPA, has been actively adverse to coal, and that policy hurts America. Thank you again for this opportunity to testify.
Thank you all for your testimony. I'll now recognize myself for a round of questioning. And I'll start with Mr. Drevna. There's a map they're going to put up on the screen here. It just happens to show the Keystone Pipeline. Now, when you work with refiners and you get North Dakota, American, we'll ignore the part. You notice that I don't attach any jobs to Canada. I do look at the $100,000 per employee, including bonuses that currently are being paid for North Dakota jobs, $70,000 plus bonuses. And by the way, I understand that they're paying a couple $1,000s in bonuses just to go to work for McDonald's because they have less than 1% up there. But when you look at that, when you get oil from those refineries today, my understanding is because there's no pipeline, you'd get the oil from North Dakota, you'd get it by truck or train. Is that correct?
If it were to come from the Bakken reserves, that's the only way to get it.
Okay, which means that they'd have a higher carbon footprint by transporting a less efficient way. Literally, by not building the pipeline, we're burning more carbon to inefficiently deliver oil that we're going to ultimately use from somewhere in the world. Isn't that right?
Mr. Chairman, the most inefficient way to transport oil is either by rail or by truck.
So not building the pipeline is, in fact, environmentally hazardous because if you care about the carbon footprint, you're increasing it through that inefficiency.
Especially, Mr. Chairman, you're absolutely right, especially when you consider that our good friends and neighbors to the North Canada, that oil is going to go somewhere. It's not going to stay in the ground up there.
No, it's not. Mr. Weiss, I'm going to ask unanimous consent that the President's March 2012 plan in which or actually propaganda piece, what was it actually called? It's the 2012, can I look at yours since you have it? Yeah. This is hot off the presses, pretty much. A Secure Energy Future Progress Report that cites that $8,000. I'll note that it cites it over an undescribed period of time, not per year. In fact, it appears to cite between now and 2025. But we'll leave that alone because ultimately the American family doesn't spend $8,000 per year today on gasoline. So,
can I address
no, you can't. In order to get that savings, you must necessarily quadruple prices and then get your 54 miles per gallon. But we'll put that entire thing in the record, and I'll ask my staff to file a counter report. No, I didn't ask him a question. But I do have a question for Mr. Glazer. If we'll put up the chart that the President came out with for his all-of-the-above strategy, what? It was on his campaign website. So that's the real thing. Mr. Glazer, I know it's hard to see, but will you note there that nuclear is included, biofuels, but coal is omitted?
Yes, and I don't think that's a mistake either.
Well, he must have considered it a mistake because he corrected it when being pointed out that he had no coal. Would you put up the next slide? The next slide says clean coal. So is that to imply that the coal of today is unacceptable and thus he has no plan for coal, only a plan for coal when it's somehow different than it is here today?
Yeah, I actually don't know what that means. Coal, is, as I indicated in my testimony, is being burned in an increasingly clean fashion. There's no reason that we need to dial coal out of the American energy equation.
But isn't the administration currently, by new standards that are shutting down at least 26 gigawatts of electric power because these coal plants are shutting down, essentially taking the 46% of our energy that comes from coal and ratcheting it down as we speak?
Yeah, right. And that 26 gigawatts figure, of course, is only currently announced retirements. The projections are much higher than that.
Okay. Mr. Weiss, I do have a question for you. Now, you stated that more oil would not reduce the cost. You wouldn't make the same statement about natural gas, would you? No, that's a yes or no. Would you or wouldn't you make the same statement? about natural gas?
No, I would not, because that is not priced on the global market in the way that oil is.
Very good.
Cartel.
So when you put more into a market, you reduce price. In other words, even progressives believe that supply and demand actually works, that more supply with a given demand will in fact reduce cost.
I do not agree with that when the price is set by a cartel.
Well, let's go through that. Isn't it,
of our reserve.
Mr. Weiss, that wasn't a question. And by the way, a fraction of the world's oil comes from cartels. The fact is that natural gas is proof. We have the lowest cost of natural gas of anyone in the world. We deliver clean natural gas throughout the world. As a matter of fact, if Mr. Markey wasn't blocking it from going to New England, they'd be taking out fuel oil and putting in natural gas. But let me just get to the main point. The assumption that the world does not have enough oil, and that if the world had abundance of oil and other fuels, that in fact the world price would go down, you'd have to agree with, wouldn't you, that ultimately if non-cartel states like Canada and the United States were producing an abundance of oil, we would in fact break the back of the cartels, bring down the price on a global basis, wouldn't we?
I do not agree. The price is set by a cartel.
Well, why don't we go through?
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr.
Weiss, you answered the question.
You answered the gasoline prices that we have here.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for deciding that you're going to be an economist here after you agreed that it worked in natural gas. Mr. Drevna, perhaps you're a little bit more reasonable. If, in fact, the world supply reaches a glut, as it periodically does, as it did in the early part, I believe, of the Bush administration when we got down to like $9 or $10 a barrel for a short time. Ultimately, with supply and demand on a global basis, it is a world market because it's so transportable, don't we in fact reduce the cost of barrel? Weren't your refiners paying dramatically less when for a period of time there was an excess?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman.
Isn't it also true that the difference between a shortage that drives up the price to $100 a barrel and more and an excess that can drive the price down into the teens at times can be a very small amount relative to the world demand?
That's absolutely correct, Mr. Chairman. When you look at the cost of production of various wells throughout the world, it's the last barrel in that makes the difference. But if we're serious about our own energy and national security, and if you'll permit me, some statistics.
Of course.
4 years ago, natural gas was $11.70 per million BTU. Today, it's $2.40. A couple of days ago, it was $2.43. 4 years ago, West Texas Intermediate was $127 a barrel. Today, a couple of days ago, it was $87.57. And why is that? Because natural gas production is up dramatically, and even on state lands, I must admit again, on state lands, crude oil production is up dramatically in this country. If we want to send a message, if we want to take care of the American economy, if we want to let the rest of the world know that we're dead serious about our energy and national security, let's open up our own God-given reserves.
And I'll give the ranking member equal time. But, Mr. Kranzer, the natural gas that you have in abundance in Pennsylvania and our common birthplace, Ohio, isn't it a highly substitutable fuel over the intermediate stage for oil and gas? In other words, can't your natural gas in greater numbers, and we had the Secretary of Energy here telling us about the advancements, be substituted? And if so, isn't it true that you're talking about less than $1.50 a gallon for the equivalent amount of natural gas in today's prices?
Absolutely correct. It's substitutable on a number of fronts. I used to be in the electricity generation business. I work for a company. There's what's going on, a dash to gas going on right now, gas-fueled power plants. Gas-fueled liquid and compressed natural gas transportation vehicles could prove the key to clean air in urban areas like the area I live near Philadelphia and in Pittsburgh and so forth. So you're absolutely right.
So, in fact, our natural gas is just as much part of breaking the back of the world cartels as our oil production.
Absolutely correct.
Thank you. I'd ask the gentleman from have 9 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Weiss, is it? So that the record will be clear, the Chairman asked you about the $8,000 figure. You never said annually. I never said annually. And would you clear that up? I'll clear mine up, but you clear yours up.
Thank you, Mr. Cummings.
Because it was never said.
Sorry. That $8,000 figure is over the lifetime of the vehicle, and it compares gasoline purchases by a 2025 average model, which will be 54.5 miles per gallon, compared to a 2010 model, which was averaging at 27.5 miles per gallon. It's an $8,000 difference over the life of the vehicle. It was generated by the White House, I believe, and since I'm under oath, I don't want to swear to it, but I believe it was generated by the White House using Department of Transportation data, and that it assumes a relatively low price for gasoline of $2.50 per gallon. So that's where that figure comes from.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Weiss. In 2001, under the Bush administration, 2.12 billion barrels of crude oil were produced from U.S. fields, and total oil production fell every single year since 2001. According to the Energy Information Administration, from 2001 through 2008, oil production of United States fields fell by more than 14%. Mr. Weiss, have you seen this data? And isn't it true, according to EIA data, that U.S. production of crude oil fell each year under the Bush administration? Is that correct?
I would have to go back and look at that data, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, but it is clearly up since President Obama took office. We were at about 4.7 million barrels per day, I believe, in 2008. This year, Energy Information Administration predicts we'll be at 6.2 million barrels per day, which is about a 30% increase, if I did the math correctly, over what the last year of the Bush administration.
Well, let me clarify that a little bit more. During the last year of the Bush administration, 1.811 billion barrels were produced from United States fields. In 2009, the first year of the Obama administration, this figure went up to 1.956 billion barrels produced. In 2010, the figure continued to climb. And folks want to talk about in spite of, but the fact is, numbers are going up. Continued to climb to 1.998 billion barrels. This upward trend continued in 2011, when 2.066 billion barrels were produced. Mr. Weiss, comparing the last year of the Obama administration to the last year of the Bush administration, oil production increased by 14%. This is based on data from the Energy Information Administration. Now, Mr. Weiss, what does this suggest to you in terms of the Obama administration's record and its commitment to domestic oil production?
There's no question that we are producing more domestic oil now than we did under the previous administration. In fact, Energy Information Administration released a report in March of 2012 that looked at the production from public lands of oil, and 2011 was 646 million barrels, 2008 575 million barrels. The 2011 production was bigger than any of the last 3 years under the previous administration, and that's from a March 2012 EIA report.
Now, Mr. Crancher, you had mentioned, you were talking about enforcement generally, I guess about with regard to EPA, and I just want to refer an article to you. It's the Mercury News, and it's dated yesterday, and it is entitled, "Oil Stats Belie Tough Enforcement Talk." And let me just read the first two paragraphs, but I just want you to just take a look at this when you get a chance. It says, in the 3 years since President Barack Obama took office, Republicans have made the Environmental Protection Agencies a lightning rod for complaints that this administration has been too tough on oil and gas producers. But an Associated Press analysis of enforcement data over the past decade finds that's not the case. In fact, the EPA went after producers more often in the years of Republican President George W. Bush, a former Texas oil man, than under Obama. And it gives a lot of details. I just refer that article to you, and I understand what you said.
Well, I appreciate that, Ranking Member. I have not read that article, and of course, enforcement is perhaps a different issue than what we're talking about, and to some extent, maybe statistics about what was produced when versus now, they may be a little bit of a red herring. What we're looking at is what we need to do in the future.
Yeah, Mr. Cranston, I promise you, I'm not trying to create red herrings. I swear to God I'm not. I'm trying to make sure that credit is given where credit is due. The fact is that it seems like all the stats are going up. And I think the thing that upsets me more than anything else is how this president seems to be given credit for nothing. No matter what he does, he's given credit for nothing. Nothing. And when there is things that are happening positive, they say stuff like, it's happening in spite of. You know, in spite of him, in spite of this. When they go bad, they say, uh-oh, the president did that. He did something wrong. And we hear that I hear it almost in every single committee I sit in. And at some point, you know, the question has to be asked, you mean the oil production going up, oil companies making record profits, and everybody's saying, oh, Obama, he's screwed up again. And when I see the numbers over and over again, I've got to tell you, it gets on my nerves. But anyway, let me go back to you, Mr. Williams. I didn't mean to get upset, but I see this all over. When the jobless rate comes down, they say, "Oh, it would have happened without him." Then or they'll say, "Oh, it's going too slow." Nobody roots for the country. They say stuff like, "It just wouldn't have happened." But then sometimes the folks take credit for things that they didn't even do. So anyway, the data shows that this is not just 1 year increase, but a sustained multi-year 14% increase in overall domestic crude oil production. Mr. Weiss, what is your response to the argument that the Obama administration does not deserve credit for those 4 years because it was reaping the benefit of the previous administration policies?
Well, first, in response to your earlier comments, it reminds me of the story that some people are like this, is that when they see Jesus walking on water, the headline in the newspaper would be, Jesus can't swim. And so I think that's sort of the treatment that the president's getting. In terms of yes, a lot of this production began under the previous administration, but those people who claim that the president is not pursuing an all-the-above strategy or is launching a war on oil or a war on coal, when oil production is up, coal mining employment is up compared to the previous administration, it's hard to understand where is the record behind that, not the rhetoric, but where's the record behind those charges.
In March of this year, this is my last question, the Energy Information Agency issued a report entitled Sales of Fossil Fuels Produced on Federal and Indian Lands, FY 2003 through 2011. According to the report, the 2 best years for oil production, both offshore and onshore, occurred under the Obama administration. In 2011, 112 million barrels were produced onshore on federal lands, and in 2010, 618 million barrels were produced offshore on federal land. Mr. Weiss, are you aware of that report?
Yes, Mr. Cummings, that was the report that I referred to earlier that demonstrates conclusively that we're producing more oil from our federal lands and waters in the last 3 years of this administration than in the last 3 years of the previous administration.
Of course. Thank you all. We now go to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly, who was here at the start.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm certainly not going to compare anybody to the Lord and their ability to walk on water. But, Secretary Crancer, as you know, I'm from Pennsylvania, and you are too, and I've been in your presence before. Pennsylvania has done an awful lot as far as the natural gas exploration. You just walk us through a little bit the opportunities. As I know, right now, Pennsylvania is called the Saudi Arabia of natural gas. We're talking about at least 2 centuries of supply. We're talking about coal, 2 centuries of supply of coal, and we're talking about also our ability to sever our reliance on imported energy. And I wonder about fossils that are so greatly abundant, accessible, and affordable, and why, when you look at the current administration's record, as much as we'd like to say that there's a lot more being found, a lot more being produced, a lot of that's coming from the private sector, people who have their own skin in the game and are actually taking that step forward. If you could, tell us a little bit what Pennsylvania's done, and I'm trying to understand why anybody inside this beltway would think that they're more concerned about air and water in Pennsylvania than you are.
Well, thank you for that. You're exactly right, and I mentioned that early on. My job is to protect the environment. That's what we do, and that's what my agency does. And your question is a good one, and let me follow up to what the Chairman said. Chairman Issa, he said that our natural gas production in Pennsylvania and elsewhere could provide the key to unlocking the cartels, the oil cartels. It's much broader than that. Right in our state now, we are seeing a renaissance, and it was spoken about earlier in the testimony, of petrochemical industry in America, right here in Pennsylvania. For the first time in my lifetime, maybe in all of your lifetimes as well, the United States of America could potentially enjoy a cost advantage over overseas in petrochemical, ethane to ethylene. We're seeing what's happened right now with respect to Shell and possibly Shell, and I mean possibly because we are only in the first inning of that situation, building a cracker facility in Beaver County. We are seeing the same thing in southeastern PA, which is my backyard. We're seeing the potential petrochemical renaissance in one of our oil refineries that had been shut down. We're seeing the Bakken crude, for example, providing the economic turnaround for another one of our oil refineries in the southeast. So the potential here is gargantuan, and on my side of the ledger, and I can talk about the economics all day because I have an economics degree. I'm an amateur compared to Mr. Perry, but I do know economics. The clean air potential, which I discussed earlier, in cities like mine, Philadelphia, cities like the Governor's, Pittsburgh, and when you have clean air, you have healthier people, you have more business opportunities, and so forth. So the immense possibility for economic revival, environmental cleanup, environmental improvement, and health improvement, they're all there, and they're all there right under our footprints in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in Oklahoma, and in many other states.
If you could, what advice would you give Federal regulators right now? Because when I'm back home in Northwest Pennsylvania, I get a chance to talk to all these folks that are involved in this industry. They tell me how difficult it is to navigate the permitting process, and that the length of time that it takes to get these online. If you could, what kind of advice could we give the Feds?
Well, my prime advice would be to back off, because the states, including mine, including Oklahoma, including West Virginia, including Texas, Louisiana, you name it, and I don't mean to leave anybody out, are doing a good job regulating hydraulic fracturing, I'll point to that, in their states where it takes place. The Federal Government, all of a sudden, out of the blue, despite the history, and I can go through the legal history about this, all of a sudden is showing an interest in hydraulic fracturing and regulating hydraulic fracturing. Never before had the Federal Government, at any level, regardless of the administration, shown any such interest in doing so. And I would also encourage the other branches of the Federal Government. It's not just about the EPA. The Army Corps, for example, with respect to developing infrastructure, is overstepping its review of projects and treating projects today differently, pipelines, than they ever had in the past. So my advice would be trust the states. The states in which this is happening know exactly what they're doing. They've been at it for generations, and we're on top of it.
And the length of the permitting is the thing that bothers me, because with the exception of something that the Federal Government would do, time is of the essence for those in the private sector. And it's the waiting and the not knowing and the uncertainty if you're even going to get your permit, and to think that you can keep crews on the sideline, you can keep equipment on the sideline, and just keep it warm until they're ready to get in the game once they get a permit. It's absolutely stifling these folks. It's causing them great losses of income, and it's also keeping this country from reaching the energy independence that we've been seeking since the early 70s. Length of time, just real quick, what's the length of time do you think for permitting? A guy that's going to do a coal?
It varies, but let me just say this to sum it up. What I see is Federal overlay, which is adding no environmental protection on the ground. which is causing delay. And, you just look at the Environmental Protection Agency, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. They've got an unbelievable fast track on regulations. They produce more regulations in air, in NAAQS, in 3.5 years than I think the total of 16 years of prior two administrations. When you get to permitting, that's the snail track.
Well, I ask unanimous consent the gentleman have an additional minute. Without objection, would the gentleman yield?
Yeah, I mean, because I think the critical aspect of this is what we're not seeing. And I was, earlier in the spring, we were talking about there was no relationship between supply and demand, that no matter what, there was no way we could control the price of gas because it was just going to go off the chart because of all these people that gamed the situation. But it's a basic economic belief that supply and demand are the drivers of the cost of energy.
I agree with the gentleman. Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, I will.
Following up on the gentleman's question, Mr. Perry, since it's widely considered accurate on both sides of the aisle that it takes as much as 10 years from the beginning of a drilling process to a productive well, when the folks on the dais keep talking about the last 3 years of President Bush and the first 3 years of President Obama, how would that 10 years work from a standpoint of when product would come online, thus giving that increase? When would you have to begin in order to get a benefit, let's say this year? What administration, what year?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'm not really an expert on the permitting process, but I do know that
the chart's up on the board showing the lease sale ratio. Oh, I'm sorry. Why don't you explain your chart and that'll end the questioning on it.
Great. I appreciate that. Right now we're seeing permitting times taking on average 298 days. But before you even get to where you can drill a well and where you can permit that well, you have to go through the environmental analysis process. We're right now seeing environmental analyses taking over 7 years. And that's the study I cited in my testimony where we've got just 20 projects in the West, 3,100 wells a year. The projects are over 10 to 15 years. Those 20 projects could generate 21,000 jobs and $27.5 billion in economic activity every year, except that they're now sitting in the environmental analysis phase. So what we're seeing, one of the long points on that timeline is the environmental analysis. So you start with, you get your lease, there's some exploratory work done, you drill an exploratory well that might take you 3 years to get that environmental analysis done, and that's not the operator doing that, that's the federal government. So even a small project, even a 9-well project can take 4 years to get that environmental analysis done. So let's say your well is successful, then you need to go and maybe do a larger project, maybe it's 100 or 1,000 wells. That environmental analysis is now taking over 7 years in many cases. So that's the long pole in the tent, so to speak, where it can take you over 10 years till you're actually fully producing on the lease, not because it can't be done by the operator, but because of government delays. We see on corresponding state and private lands where it can take a matter of months to a year to start producing.
So it's fair to say that President Clinton, his oil production was, in fact, the Reagan-Bush years. President Bush, the son, his oil production was the Bill Clinton years. And, in fact, Obama's are the W. Bush years. That essentially every president in 4 or preferably 8 years for most, they're, in fact, the period of time that the next enjoys in that roughly 8 to 10 years.
Exactly. I mean, it's a minimum 3 to 5 years before you can start operating on federal lands compared to a year for private or state lands.
Thank you. We now go to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Tierney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to spend a lot of time on going back and forth on this political stuff. I just note that the facts are somewhat clear. Since 2008, total U.S. crude oil production has climbed 14%. In 2010, the United States natural gas production reached a record of 26.9 trillion cubic feet, which was a 5% increase from 2008 and the highest level in more than 30 years. The 2 best years since 2003 for the production of natural gas on onshore federal lands occurred in 2009 and 2010. In 2011, the Department of the Interior offered approximately 21 million additional acres for offshore oil and gas development. In 2012, an additional 38 million acres will be offered as part of a lease sale in the central Gulf of Mexico, and an area estimated to hold close to 31 billion barrels of oil and 134 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, so on and so forth on the public land. So I think this debate, or trying to make the President look bad or something like that is a little silly. But I want to go to another aspect of this. Mr. Weiss, the oil and gas industry has been around for about 100 years, would you agree? Been in operation? Right. And the oil and gas, I don't think you could call them an emergent technology any longer. Do you think so?
No, sir. I believe the first oil was produced in Pennsylvania in 1850s. I defer to Mr. Krancer on that one.
So the first quarter of 2012, the top 5 oil companies earned $30 billion.
Actually, $33.5 billion. That's correct.
And over the last 10 years, the top 5 oil companies got more than $850 billion in profits. Is that about right?
Yes, and we estimate that it's over $1 trillion if you use 2011 dollars, adjust for inflation. So
Exxon alone made $80 billion last year, which is about $5 million an hour.
Yes, about that.
All right. So, my point on all of this is that the Congressional Research Service tells us that in the fiscal year 2013 budget, they'd be getting $39 billion in taxpayer subsidies. And if subsidies are for helping emergent technologies, would you agree with me, seems we're beyond that point and this is taxpayer money just thrown out the window?
Yes, in fact, one of the tax breaks that applies only to the oil industry dates back to 1916. Meanwhile, the tax incentives that go for wind power expires at the end of this year.
Okay. So since 1918 to 2009, the oil and gas average subsidy is $4.86 billion a year, taxpayer money to an incredibly profitable industry on that basis. From 1994 to 2009, renewable energies got about $370 million a year. So it's quite a disparity. So we have the emerging industry, which is the renewables, getting a fraction of what this mature, extremely profitable industry is getting. Can you explain any public policy rationale behind that?
Well, I couldn't explain on a policy rationale. My guess is you could guess the political rationale for that. And I think it's important to note that although some from the oil industry will say, don't take away these tax breaks because that's like a tax increase on us. In fact, a number of Republican leaders, including a chief economist for Ronald Reagan, have all said that these tax breaks are just the same as government spending, just done through the tax code rather than a direct grant. And it's important to remember that when we're looking at these huge tax expenditures.
Well, yeah, I also know, look, between 2004 and 2008, the top 5 oil companies spent an average of 42% of their profits on stock repurchases. So they're just buying back their own stock and making themselves more valuable on that. And so I guess the policy question would be why, Mr. Weiss, should the United States taxpayers be forced to subsidize stock repurchases from oil and gas companies?
To me, there is no apparent policy goal that's being served by that, particularly when the amount of money is trivial compared to the amount of profits that this industry is making. The big 5 oil companies will get about $2.4 billion in tax breaks for this year, and they're on track to make around $120 billion in profits. They buy back their own stock with about 1/3 of that money, and they're sitting on about $60 billion in cash reserves. They don't need the $2.5 billion a year in tax breaks, especially when we're cutting money for wind, for Pell Grants, for other very important needs. It seems to me not a good
or I might note for keeping the need-based interest on student loans at 3.4% instead of 6.8%. But that's just personal interest. My bill would have paid for them by taking away just one of those subsidies. Let me ask you a little bit about the nuclear industry. That's also a mature industry. Do you agree?
Yes, it began in 1947 is when we first began subsidizing the nuclear industry.
And yet the American taxpayer continues to absorb the risk for that because they can't find private insurers. Is that correct?
That's under the Price-Anderson Act, but in addition, we're giving them a loan guarantee to build the 2 new reactors in Georgia that were the first approved in 30 years and it was approved by this President.
So it seems to me, Mr. Chairman, that rather than sitting around here playing politics with, the President did this or didn't do that, maybe we ought to be talking about the policy going forward for the American taxpayer, spending their money on the things that are going to build this country and build our foundation for future jobs as opposed to larding up on the oil and gas industry.
I don't have any question that could be valuable. I would also suggest that perhaps your witness could tell us all how much taxes those oil companies paid.
Well, I would suggest that that's sort of irrelevant. I hope they're paying their fair share of taxes. What I also hope is that they're not getting our tax money to buy back their own stock when they're making tremendous profits. That would be a good hearing to have here today instead of loading up 5 to 1. Mr. Weiss, what do you think?
Well, in fact, Reuters just did an analysis of this and found that ExxonMobil paid 13% of its U.S. income in federal taxes after deductions of benefits in 2011, and that compares to the typical business rate of 35%. ConocoPhillips and Chevron were at about 18 and 19% last year, according to Reuters News Service.
So, Mr. Chairman, let's have that hearing.
Mr. Drevno, you want to elaborate on that to fill out the answer?
Well, at the severe risk, when in this country has it become wrong to employ 9.2 million people?
Let me answer. I reclaim my time.
The gentleman's time has
expired. Whether or not they're paying their fair share of taxes, whether or not they're getting subsidized by taxpayers when they needn't be subsidized.
There are no subsidies.
Of course they're hiring people. They're in business. They have to get people to extract their product and produce it so they can make their product. Every company does that, but a lot of companies pay their fair share, and a lot of companies don't get subsidized to buy back their own stock when they're extremely profitable. So that was the issue, and that was the question, not whether they're employing X amount of people.
The gentleman may complete his answer.
And the answer is no, sir, they're not getting subsidies. There are no subsidies. If your desire is to change the tax code, fine. Change the tax code. Make it fair. Make it fair for everyone. But don't pick on oil companies and natural gas companies and refiners who pay their fair share to the tune of $86 million a day in taxes. We are the most heavily taxed industry in this country, and we do provide those jobs. And you can't snuff off the jobs. You can't snuff off the jobs, the taxes that those 9.2 million people pay. And I would suggest, Congressman, that I think we would do better in this country with a lot more ExxonMobils, Chevrons, and ConocoPhillips, and a few less Solyndras, and maybe this country would be moving forward in a better way. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Oklahoma, a place in which we receive a lot of tax revenue, for 5 minutes. Mr. Lankford.
There are a lot of companies in Oklahoma that do provide a lot of revenue to the Federal Government. Let me just mention a couple of things that I find ironic in some of this conversation. One is to talk about Chevron only pays 18% tax after everything else, when GE pays 0. And if you look at the top 5 energy companies in America on the new Fortune 500 list and compare them to the top 5 technology companies, guess who makes more profit? That would be the technology companies, not the energy companies. But I hear scant from anyone saying, we need to go after that Apple, we need to go after Microsoft, we need to go after Intel. They make too much money. Instead, it is a pet project to try to diminish fossil fuels and traditional energy and to go after them. This is not about tax dollars. This is about a political process to say, we want to try to wipe out traditional energies to try to benefit solar and wind and such. Now, if we're going to have all the above, let's do all the above. Let's stop trying to pick on one industry and to say the way we'll benefit solar and wind is by trying to destroy another industry. Let me hit on just a couple things. Mr. Perry, economically, what would happen if the United States became energy independent? What would happen to our economy if we really were truly energy independent?
Well, I think we could look to the what some people call the economic miracle state of North Dakota and see what happens when we have abundant energy that's actually produced. North Dakota has an unemployment rate of 3%. In the heart of the Bakken, Williston, North Dakota, and Williams County have unemployment rates less than 1%. The state has a budget surplus in terms of state income growth, personal income growth. They lead the country in terms of prosperity. So I think in addition to being energy independent, I think producing energy within the United States using the treasures beneath the lands that we have, I think we can look to what's happening in North Dakota and in Pennsylvania and now in Oklahoma and Eagle Ford in Texas and places like that to see the economic stimulus that it would have in addition to helping in terms of energy independence.
Right. We are currently on a model that the Federal Government has to fund new energy sources versus what can we do to unleash the energy that we have and unleash our economy. So I am astounded by the fact that if we were to really become energy independent, to really go after the energy that we have, to produce that and to use it ourselves, the job creation, the tax revenue that would be, the lease money that we would acquire from Federal lands and the royalties and such. It is unbelievable the amount of money that is sitting on the sidelines, literally under our feet, that we are restrained from being able to go after on that. Ms. Gama, I want to ask you about this private versus public lands. You've mentioned that a couple of times on it. The current production, we understand now, current production that's happening on public lands was permitted in previous administrations and is now occurring. What's the permitting process right now? How many permits are going out? How many new projects are starting or being permitted on public lands right now?
Well, if you look at the NEPA, which is really the long period of time that it takes to get a project through, we're seeing NEPA taking over 7 years. So this Interior Department has approved just 2 large projects. Just 2, right. And there are 20 projects that have been proposed that could create 121,000 jobs.
So of 20 projects proposed, 2 have been approved, and then so we're talking out 10 years from now, what happens in production on Federal lands?
Well, exactly. That's pushing out into the future. That means we're going to have much less production in the future because of the long lead times on Federal lands.
Can anyone identify the President and the Administration talks often about production and how production has increased. Can anyone identify an element that this Administration has done to increase production, that they can point to and say, because the Administration did that, this Administration, because this Administration did that action, we have increased production?
I can only see a lot of obstacles that have been put in place of my producers on Federal lands, both from the EPA, from the Interior Department, regulations that are making it more difficult, time-consuming, costly. The Interior Department admits to 298 days to process a permit.
That's a long time to do a permit.
It is, considering that states usually get it done in about 30 days.
Okay. Mr. Weiss, sounds like you want to be able to jump in.
Yes, I believe that the Shell is going to be exploring in the Arctic Ocean, in the Chukchi Sea off the northern coast of Alaska this summer, which was approved under this administration.
Okay, but that is something that will actually be done years from now. I was talking about current production. You mentioned often about this administration has got more production than the previous administration. What has this administration done proactively to create that? Can anyone name anything? See, this is a product of the actions of previous administration and of the free market and of drilling on private lands. This administration is taking credit for increased production when this administration proactively has done nothing to do that. It is as if the train is moving and they ran and jumped in the engineer's position and said, hey, look, I'm at the front of the train. And I've got to tell you, I'm glad that we are increasing production, but it's always tough for me when someone in politics takes credit for something they didn't do. And for that, I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield? Oh, I'm sorry, the gentleman's time has expired. We now go to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I must note that, unfortunately, for much too long, my state has been sending more revenue to Washington than it's been getting back. And I also have to note that we've got one county that has more people than half the states in America in it. And so those are interesting comparisons relative to employment statistics and opportunities that do in fact exist. But it seems to me that the premise of this hearing appears to be that the Obama administration is not doing enough to encourage development of all sectors of the energy economy. And I'd like to understand how natural gas production has fared under the administration as compared to the previous administration. According to the Energy Information Administration, in 2008, President Bush's last year in office, about 25.6 trillion cubic feet of natural gas was produced. In 2009, the first year of the Obama administration, this figure increased to 26 trillion cubic feet produced. This trend has continued, and in 2011, almost 29 trillion cubic feet were produced. Mr. Weiss, let me ask you, based on this data from the Energy Information Administration, it appears that natural gas production has hit record levels during the Obama administration. Is that accurate?
I believe so, that it is, sir, yes.
Well, critics have argued that President Obama wanted to curtail natural gas production, but these statistics suggest otherwise. These figures suggest that President Obama has continued many of the same policies as his predecessor in terms of natural gas production. Is that right?
When it comes to onshore, yes. With offshore, they're making sure, like with the oil rigs, that the natural gas rigs are produced in a much more safe manner, so that way it protects the workers on the rigs and reduces the prospects of another oil disaster. And in fact, even though they put in tighter rules, we expect by the end of the year, I think Bloomberg reported that there will be as many rigs operating in the deep water in the Gulf of Mexico, but more safely than before the BP Deepwater disaster, and those rigs most of them will produce both oil and gas.
Well, let me ask you, are there any significant differences between the policies of President Obama and the policies of President Bush as it relates to natural gas reduction?
There is one, which is that under the Clean Air Act, the administration was required by law to produce standards for the release of air pollution from oil and natural gas production. And so the President has implemented those laws and proposed final standards that would protect humans from some of those emissions from those facilities.
Well, Mr. Trevino, let me ask you, doesn't this relatively steady trend of production suggest that there are minimal differences between how the two administrations have managed natural gas production?
I'm sorry, Mr. Davis. The difference being, and it's been said before, it's been innovation and ingenuity by entrepreneurs on state and private lands and on federal lands that have increased dramatically the numbers that you so rightfully suggested. If you look at the percent of natural gas developed on federal land, it's down 14% over that time frame. So, let's not sit and say this versus that. Let's say, what are we going to do going forward? What are we going to do to make this country energy and secure and national secure? The best way to do it is again, the all-the-above approach, which includes all the above and all the below, as we said before. That's going forward. That's what we need to do.
And I can agree with that, but I also can agree that in order to determine how you need to go and where you need to go, it's good to look at where you've been and to look at where you are.
You're absolutely right, Mr. Davis. And the question is then, did all this production start on January 20th of 2009? No. It was in the pipeline going forward. When we developed the horizontal drilling with combination of hydraulic fracturing, it opened up vast new reserves throughout the country, as Secretary Cancer had said. Let's go forward. Let's see how we're going to do it. Let's open up these lands, and let's give the American people and the consumer what they deserve.
Well, thank you very much, and I just simply have to agree with Mr. Cummings that it seems as though President Obama gets no credit for the massive increases in oil and gas production during his administration, and President Bush gets no blame for the oil and gas reductions during his administration. Thank you very much.
I thank the gentleman. We now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Fahrenholt, and I would ask if you would yield just for one quick moment.
I'd be happy to yield, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Dredra, is there any appreciable, I'll put it that way to make sure we don't leave a little what if, any likelihood that there's any federal lands producing new oil or natural gas that was begun during the last 3.5 years?
I can't see how.
So with zero coming online during the Obama administration, it is reasonable to say 100% of the gain comes from the previous administration.
Or previous administrations.
Or even previous administration. Right. Thank you. I thank the gentleman. Yield back.
And following up on that same line of question, Ms. Sagama, my family's been in the oil and gas business since my great-grandfather was an independent producer. And even back when I was practicing law 20 or so years ago, we would give leases with 90-day primary terms. That was drill a well within 90 days or it's gone. Even today, my friend Michael Bergsma just leased some property that we owned about a year ago. We gave him a 2-year lease. And on private lands, we're able to get that done in 2 years with no significant environmental. Can you just go down a laundry list of, I mean, it's taken 7 plus 10 years on federal land. How can we fix that?
Well, I think just having the government do its job. Right now we're seeing, you talk about we don't even get our leases issued within 90 days. Sometimes we're waiting years. In fact, Western Energy Alliance had to sue the government because it was holding leases for 2 to 5 years. We're still appealing that because we didn't get a full victory on that one. We're seeing then environmental analysis for even small projects taking 3, 4 years. You can't even go and submit your permit to drill until you've gotten through that environmental analysis. And for larger projects, that's taking 7 years, 8 years. So then once you get through that, then you have to submit for a permit to drill, and that average is 298 days, but it's not uncommon for a permit to take 2 to 3 years.
Well, let's talk about unemployment rates now. I mean, we were talking about North Dakota, where we're down to 1% unemployment. I know in Victoria, which is in the Eagleford, I was told by their economic development folks, though nominally in the 6%, they're at full employment. If you can pass a drug test and are willing to work, there's a job for you. We're hearing that they're having to import people into the Dakotas to work. I know in Corpus Christi, our hotels are full of workers that are working in the Eagleford Shale. In Victoria, a Best Western hotel, $230 a night, housing oil field work. I mean, this is a huge, huge economic boom. I guess, Mr. Dravanik, can you talk about some of the jobs that are coming out of that? What type of jobs and what kind of salary levels we are looking at? To me, these are good, high-paying, middle to upper middle-class jobs.
Absolutely, Congressman. These are jobs that you don't really need a college education for. You need some skills, and we can train. That's what we do. You can have a great middle-class life, get paid very well, send your kids to school, take vacations. These are the kind of opportunities the U.S. oil and natural gas and refining businesses provide. And going back to my old hometown, and in all deference to the Philadelphia and Cleveland back in Pittsburgh, I mean, you go back to my old hometown, where Shell is proposing to build that ethylene cracker up the Ohio Valley there. It's unbelievable.
Do you think they're going to actually build that? I mean, I'm hearing a lot about decreased refining capacity in the United States and the inability to permit new refineries or large increases in capacity in refining. And that also, our refining capacity has a direct impact on gasoline prices, doesn't it?
Oh, it does. And not only has the refining capacity, but the regulations, including the renewable fuel standard, that year after year after year takes away more and more of the market of refiners and little or absolutely no benefit to the economy or no benefit to the environment. But you're right. I think the Secretary mentioned it briefly before. Hey, we're in step one of many steps of getting that.
So I'm running out of time. Looks like we've got a war on additional refining capacities, or at least a very difficult there. And it looks like, and Mr. Glasser, we've got an issue with a war on coal. I know there was a county just south of Houston that was talking about building a coal plant, which escapes me with the price of gas what it is, but they believe in diversity of fuels. And the EPA basically descended on that town, threatening to put them in noncompliance in air quality, despite the fact they were basically upwind from Houston. Are we seeing that all over?
Yes. As I mentioned in my testimony, the administration has one rule in place, the MATS or UMAC rule, and another rule proposed, the Greenhouse Gas New Source Performance Standards rule, under which you can't build a coal plant. I mean, you just can't build a coal plant. That is a policy that is inconsistent with the notion of an all-of-the-above energy policy. It is reflective of what we're seeing throughout the administrations, and particularly EPA's policies, and they are having an effect, contrary to what Mr. Weiss said, that implies that Coal employment is at an all-time high. I would simply suggest that looking at 2011 figures is a little disingenuous, because all of these policies are just coming into effect right now. The pollution rules that the administration has adopted have begun this year, and if you look what's going on in the marketplace right now, you would be hard-pressed to say that coal employment was up.
I thank you very much. I see my time has expired.
I thank the gentleman. I now ask unanimous consent that the committee report of May 23, 2011 be inserted at this time. Without objection, so order, and particularly take note of the portion of this report that related to the $2.1 billion that Shell had spent from 2008 on the very project that Mr. Weiss now takes credit for in an election year, 3.5 years in, for the permit being granted, a permit that was delayed for those 3.5 years. With that, we recognize the gentleman from Vermont for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Krancer, you're from Pennsylvania. Mr. Kelly, I listened to in his questions, and my understanding is that there is this explosion in energy development because of gas. I mean, that's a real competitive advantage for us, and you are leading the way in Pennsylvania. Is that your view?
Well, that's certainly part of the story. There is natural gas is now accessible that wasn't accessible before, and as I said, the production in Pennsylvania has quadrupled since 2009. And by the way, referring to, I think it was Representative Davis, the Federal Government has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that production in Pennsylvania of natural gas quadrupled. As a matter of fact, by definition, because the Federal Government was not involved, that is what happened.
Well, there's been discoveries across the country of this huge reservoir of natural gas, and that fracking is a device by which that can be extracted. And
well, more accurately, there's been discoveries of ways to access and obtain the gas in a much more efficient manner, by the way.
And you have a lot of responsibility to make sure that that's done in a way that doesn't degrade the environment, particularly water quality, correct?
Water quality, air quality,
right. And
the whole.
My understanding of what you were recommending was not that there be no regulatory oversight, but you believe that that regulatory oversight is better done at the State rather than the Federal level. Is that more or less correct?
Oh, I not only believe it, I see it every single day.
So you don't have an opposition. In fact, you believe in appropriate regulatory behavior to protect air and water quality. Is that right?
I'm the Secretary of the Department of Environmental Protection.
Right.
I believe in
adherence to rules. We're not having a debate about whether there has to be some degree of regulation. There's always room for improvement, and you get to an answer sooner rather than later. Would the members of the panel more or less agree with that? Mr. Drevna, how about you?
I agree with the Secretary that we take these things seriously.
Okay, let me go to Mr. Glass.
Yes.
How about you? I mean, coal obviously has some side effects, or is that not anything you agree with?
No, we absolutely believe that coal is compatible with good environmental protection, no doubt about it.
Is there any mercury contamination that is affected by the downwind places from the coal plants?
There's no question that power plants in the United States emit relatively minute amounts of mercury, particularly compared with the amount of mercury blowing in from overseas. There's also no question that mercury can be controlled.
So
there's finally no question that the rule that the administration adopted to control mercury,
let me ask the questions, all right? So you're acknowledging that there is some mercury pollution from coal plants, correct?
There is, as I said,
is that a yes or
relatively minute.
You are.
Yes, but there are relatively minute amounts. And the coal industry, and again, I'm speaking for myself now, but there's no doubt that reasonable regulation is a good thing throughout American energy production. I would include coal. There's no dispute with that whatsoever.
And you would acknowledge that mercury contamination as it gets into the food chain, as it gets into soil, is hazardous to the health, hazardous to air quality.
I would point to the regulatory impact analysis that EPA did in support of the rule and conclude that those benefits are vanishingly small.
So you won't answer my question?
I think I just did.
Okay. How about you, Ms. Stegma? Do you believe that there has to be some appropriate level of regulation to look out for the interest of air and water quality?
Absolutely. The oil and gas industry is one of the most heavily regulated industries. It's when that new regulation is not in balance with economic and job growth, and when it's not well thought out, it's too much, too fast, excessive, and that's killing jobs in my industry.
Well, see, I'm actually sympathetic to the concern of the regulated community that the regulatory process be straightforward, clear, that you can get an answer and you get a reasonable turnaround. I think that's a reasonable thing. What's not reasonable is to believe that we can waive away the necessity to protect air and water quality when there are processes that have an impact on it. And that's
I don't know anyone in my industry who's calling for waiving regulation. We're calling for it to be done more at the state level, though.
Well, here would be my suggestion. This is something we did in Vermont. We asked, and actually you did this, Mr. Chairman, and I thought it was okay. You know, you get specific examples of what you think can be improvements, where it's about the process working better as opposed to trying to do away with the underlying obligation, in my view, that the government has to protect the air and water quality. That's something I would be interested in. And I think you asked some of those questions, and I thought that was a fair question in the beginning. But this back and forth about who's the better president, whose policy, in my view, it doesn't really get us anywhere. I want to go on to another topic. We are having huge debates here about whether those of us, and I'm one of them, that thinks that we should be trying to give a boost to alternative energies. It's local, it's renewable, it's jobs. This is my view. That does not mean that we have to tear apart other traditional sources of fuel. I mean, you're not going to be able to turn the lights off by going to solar overnight, let's say. So the other thing is that a lot of us believe that whatever fuel source you believe in, whether it's gas or oil or coal, energy efficiency should be a major component of American energy policy, and it's an area where presumably there could be some agreement. We had a bipartisan bill last year that was going to give a boost to homeowners and to some extent building owners if they put some of their own money into retrofitting their buildings, and they get some taxpayer money to help out. No big bureaucracy, because if you own a home and you can save some money and you put some of your money in, get some government money, you're going to want to get the best deal on that. I'm curious to know whether all of you would favor an approach that would allow for retrofitting of our residential and commercial buildings with some taxpayer help.
Representative, can I take a shot at that? Because the electricity business used to be a business I had been in. Energy efficiency is already a part of the way we're implementing energy policy and commercially. It's not from the government, by the way. It is by the way of the competitive markets. And energy efficiency is something that clears a market in what we call PJM. PJM is the grid operator that spans from, I think it's New Jersey, all the way over to Illinois, Michigan, 50 million people. It's the biggest grid operator in the country. So energy efficiency is already a part of the way competitive markets are thinking. And let me just say one thing, and I know Representative Tierney mentioned it with wind and solar and so on and so forth. Wind has been something that has been a part of the power mix since 1870. So I'm not sure that that is a brand new technology either. And I don't want to get into the PTC because I know that's not what this is about. But if we are getting into subsidies of one, it by definition impacts the other. Because when you have other resources that generate power, nuclear, coal, gas, whatever it is, but you have a subsidized wind component, then, and especially at certain hours of the day, that wind farm can actually bid into the market at less than zero.
Right. I'm over my time, but the question I did ask.
Just a wee bit.
Well, it was the answer more than the question, all right? But he answered the question I didn't ask. What I was curious about, Mr. Chairman, was whether there would be general support for an efficiency program that doesn't require us to pick winners and losers, where if you're a homeowner and you're using coal or you're a homeowner and you're using gas, you get some opportunity to make your home or your commercial building more energy efficient. So you use less fuel, save money, and the people that do the retrofit are local, out-of-work contractors.
Well, I certainly would agree with the gentleman that we need to figure out ways to do it. My state unlike your state, is fairly not terribly hot or cold for most of it, but we actually have done that for a generation. All of our electric providers have annual programs, sometimes supplemented by state money, for just that. A little more pink, a fan, better sealing of windows, and so on. And I certainly agree with the gentleman that that's a component. I think today a lot of our hearing was on the time to market. The idea that on private lands you can get a permit in Texas in 90 days on an existing site. Well, it can take you 10 years if you want to go to federal lands, and of course you pay for a lease for that whole 10 years. So, but I do think the gentleman's point is good, and I'd love to explore it further.
Thank you.
And with that, and with that, we go to an important and patient witness, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I ask Mr. Glaser to expand on the answer you started when Congressman Farenthold offered you the chance to talk about the regulations from the Federal Government, especially a Utility Act, let me preface it by saying I had the opportunity as part of my responsibility as chairing the subcommittee on workforce protections and looking at MSHA, the mine industry, and the coal mine operations, to go out to North Dakota this past August and to see the surface mining operations taking place there. Revolutionary in my mind to see what was being done. The reclamation of land, the enhancement of land, the opportunities for agriculture expanded as a result of that. The clean coal technologies that are taking place, the expansion of coal-fired plants that provided necessary energy not only for North Dakota but for Minnesota as well. Amazing job opportunities for people, stable employment, people coming from other states to work there, and then having a chance to look at the Bakken Reserve and the oil exploration going on there as well was amazing. The unemployment level that was there, that's the right direction for unemployment as opposed to what I experienced for too long back in Michigan. And then just recently to hold a town hall meeting in Jackson, Michigan, and to have, as part of the, Coldwater, Michigan, have a lady pop up and say, you know, Congressman, I have a husband that's working out there in the Bakken Reserve. He's out there because he can't have a job here in Michigan. He doesn't want us to move out there because he wants to ultimately come back to Michigan to work. But he's doing what's necessary, and he has a good paying job out there, and there's an opportunity for us. And then to find out, and I don't know if we have this chart available, that the EPA regulations have already forced 25 gigawatts of generating capacity there. It's on the grid now. Generating capacity off the grid. In my state alone, over 1,200 megawatts have been forced off through energy regulation, excessive regulation, unreal regulation that's going on. In my own district, 345 gigawatts alone, that makes it more difficult when we see a turnaround taking place in Michigan in the auto industry that requires energy, that requires fuel sources. And when this lady who wants her husband back in Michigan working, when we see now a capacity necessary to deal with the increased job opportunities that are taking place in manufacturing finally again in the auto industry and supplier industries, the need for more energy, to have things like we're going to talk about, I want you to expand upon. Isn't it true that new coal-fired electric generating units, which are able to install the newest technologies, are unable to comply with Utility Act rule?
Yes, that is exactly the case, and you don't have to take my word for it. The major association of pollution equipment vendors went to EPA, and they told EPA that they frankly could not guarantee that their equipment would meet the level of EPA standards. It was so low as to be beyond the ability of the equipment to actually measure that level of emissions. So and we have the same thing with the Greenhouse Gas New Source Performance Standard. EPA has said, well, in order to build a new coal plant in the United States, you have to meet a level of CO2 emissions that EPA says coal plants frankly can't meet. So that to me is something that I don't understand, again, how you can say that you have an all-of-the-above energy policy that includes coal and at the same time say...
So there's a catch-22 going on here that says commence construction and cease construction.
Yeah, the catch-22 that EPA has put out there is they've said, well, Under our greenhouse gas rule, we recognize that there are about 15 plants out there that have spent a great deal of money and a great deal of time trying to get and have received permits, and they are just about ready to go with construction. And so what we'll do in recognition of that huge investment, we'll say, you all have a year. And if you can get built, if you can start construction in a year, then you won't be subject to this requirement that you can't meet as to your CO2 emissions. Yet at the same time, they have finalized a rule, the MATS rule or MAC rule, that these companies can't meet because the emissions are so low, because the pollution control vendors won't guarantee performance of the equipment. So these 15 projects are effectively being strangled because, on the one hand, EPA says you got a year to get into construction, but on the other hand, they've got a rule that prevents them from getting into construction, and that's the concern.
Well, I appreciate that testimony. Mr. Chairman, just this past week, I had the opportunity to fly over and be in China, India, South Korea. And I saw stacks. I saw emissions taking place there. Nothing like I've seen in Monroe, Michigan, or Jackson, Michigan, with Consumers Energy, Detroit Energy, coal-fired plants that are being put in this catch-22 situation right now, if they have not already been put out of production because of the untenable regulatory climate that goes beyond the necessity and goes beyond reality and rationality of what's necessary to move our economy forward, and do it in a sustainable and quality environmental fashion as well. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Forgive me for just walking in. I've been going back into from other hearings. But I want to make sure I understand that probably one of the biggest obstacles has been the permitting process for environmental impact studies. Is that correct, Mr. Crancer?
Well, I think it's been discussed before that certainly at the Federal level, the NEPA process takes a very, very long time.
And actually, you say process, but there's no procedure in NEPA, is there? In other words, what one agency may start, another agency may ignore, and it could last forever.
My experience in the private sector is that it could last a very long time, and the outcome was often unpredictable.
And Mr. Drebin, would you agree that a procedure should be in place in order for the process under NEPA to be followed in a timely manner?
Oh, absolutely, Mr. Roth. Not only the process under NEPA, but the entire process where at every turn there's another lawsuit or litigation that tries to stop. And they're not concurrent; they're consecutive.
And so, would standing also be an issue that something should be addressed?
I mean, I think everybody wants to do it right. No one's saying not to do it right. It's just when you create the uncertainty, when you have these interminable time delays, what are you going to do with your profits? You can't put them back in. You got to take them somewhere else.
And Mr. Weiss, are you familiar with the fact that there's been a delay even in the permitting of green energy programs?
Yes, I am, and I think that one way to address that would make sure that the people who are responsible for reviewing these analyses and issuing the permits have adequate resources and adequate staff to do that, particularly at a time when we're expanding the number of permit requests. We need to make sure that we provide them with the resources they need.
I agree with you, and I think that what you hit on there is that when you have sequential evaluation, when you have sequential review of the permitting process, you have what I consider to be a disparate allocation of resources. And so would you not agree that it would be more in line with having a concurrent review process as opposed to a sequential review process with agencies?
Certainly, we have proposed when it comes to the siting of transmission lines that the process be telescoped down in the way that you suggest, which is to make it sort of get everyone together and do it all together, local, federal, and state,
correct,
to speed up the time that it takes to permit transmission lines.
And further, would you not say that that's a fault in NEPA is that there is no procedure in place for concurrent review in the permitting process?
I am not qualified to answer that
question. Mr. Crancer?
Yeah, NEPA, it's a great question. And if there's one thing I could leave with this committee, and this is at the Federal level, of course, not the State level, is take another look at NEPA and redo it.
Would it also be advantageous to have a procedure in place that would allow for a time period by which those agencies who feel they're affected or have a need to be involved, get involved, concurrent review of the permitting process, and let's say in 4.5 years the permit must either be issued or not?
I would say 4.5 years is a very long time. I would also say that some of these folks on the panel might have a better sense for this, but to the extent there's been increases in production, I bet you donuts and dollars, those must have come from private lands, not public lands.
Right. I represent producers on public lands in the West. So we, because the West is so predominated by public lands, we're affected by those NEPA delays more than anything else. We're seeing 20 projects held up that could create 121,000 jobs, but the NEPA is taking 7 years or more.
Correct.
NEPA should be taking 2 years. And we'd love to see something where, the government gets so much time and then the project is presumed complete.
Even this President has suggested that we do some sort of expediting of the process under NEPA.
And our producers pay for contractors to do the NEPA, and the government still can't get it done.
Yeah, Mr. Weiss.
It's important to note that the lands that Ms. Scamma is talking about are owned by all Americans, and under the law, they're there for multiple use, not just for oil production, not just for coal production or whatever.
And so taxpayers own the energy under those lands.
And so therefore, we need to make sure that we know what the impacts are on all Americans, not just on their companies.
Would it not be better to have an economy of scale, a centralization of review, and an expedited process by which those who are involved in these, whether they be on private lands or public lands, know that the investment of their dollars is going to have an outcome where they're going to have in a time certain? I mean, would we all agree that that's good? And yes, sir, Mr. Drevna.
I think it would be an interesting exercise to look at what would happen, interpose NEPA and all the other requirements that we have to do on federal lands, interpose those on the development with what we've seen in Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and see if that production will be there today as it is now. I would suggest absolutely not.
Okay. I see my time has expired, and I'm the last questioner, so we'll stand adjourned. Thank you all for your time. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you.